Hey folks, Justin here. In this video, we're going to look at using a PowerApp and a flow to display the related files from SharePoint within the contact form over a model-driven PowerApp or a CRM form. The use case that prompted me to go down this path was that a customer had an external system feeding in records into CRM and the associated files into SharePoint in the appropriate spot. So there was no need for the user to actually create or upload files themselves. So the out-of-the-box SharePoint integration has additional features that in this case aren't required. So let's have a look at that out-of-the-box experience and see what issues there were. So if we open up a contact record here, forget about this SharePoint docs because that's what we're going to do in this video. But the way to get to the SharePoint files is via the Related tab, and then going to Documents, and then we get the out-of-the-box SharePoint integration. So in this case, we end up with some buttons about locations, uploading, new files, etc., which are a little bit confusing for the user that doesn't really need that. We get to choose which view we want, which is suboptimal again. We get this little button about the actual SharePoint site. And then finally, we get the list of files if there are some. So all of that's a little bit confusing when all the user wants to see is the files themselves. So let's have a look at the solution at hand. So if we come into Alex Wu's record here, I've created this tab, in this case I've called it SharePoint Docs, and if we click on this, after a moment, the PowerApp's going to come up and show me the files from SharePoint that are associated with Alex. So you can see that there's no confusion, it's just laid out, here's the files. In this case I've included the file size, and then we've got a button that allows us to open those within our local applications. So it's a fairly clean interface. The user experience is much better than all those confusing buttons and views and all that sort of thing. So let's have a look at what's involved in getting that to work. So the first step is to go into the maker experience within PowerApps. So here I am inside the environment for my CRM in this case. This would work equally for CDS. And I've created a solution, in this case called Justin Solution, and included the relevant pieces. Now, you'll notice here that there's a Canvas app and a process, which is actually the flow created within the solution. Now, that is not possible from a standard solution to add. So let's have a look at how we go about it. Now, strangely, to get this to work, to embed the Canvas app within the model-driven app or CRM form, we have to actually swap at this stage back to the classic developer experience. So I imagine not far down the track in the evolution of PowerApps, we're going to get this capability within the Maker portal. But let's, for now, swap back to the classic experience. All right. So I'll first of all start off with showing you how to actually embed the Canvas app and get the flow, because there's a couple of slight little tricks in there that caught me out the first time I was trying to do it. So if we go into the account entity, I'm just going to open up the standard account form. And once that's open, from here we can actually embed a Canvas app. Not as straightforward as what we might think. We can't go up to the Insert tab and allow us to do it from there. So what we need to do is pick a field on the form. So I'm going to use the account name in this case, just to show you how to get started. And we'll have a look at the proper solution in a moment. So if we go into the properties for this field, then we can go across to controls and we add a control from here. One of the control types, as you can see, is a Canvas app. So we click on add, and once we do that, first of all, we choose that we want the Canvas app in the web experience. And down the bottom, you'll see a customize button. That's how we create the PowerApp. So when you want to embed it, you've got to create it from that path. You can't create a normal PowerApp in the Maker experience and then embed it, primarily because, as we'll see, we'll get rid of these few messages, the key piece that we need here is this model-driven form integration component on the left side, and the only way you can get that at the moment is to create it via the form customize button. All right, so that's the first piece, is to create the Canvas app that way. Now the next piece is that we need to be able to create a flow. And bear in mind, this I'm connecting in this case to SharePoint, but we could use this same principle for connecting to any data source and bringing the data in. Now, for the flow to be available, we have to create the flow from within the PowerApp. Otherwise, the PowerApp doesn't recognize it as being suitable. I'm sure there's some flags or something that are being set. And to get that flow, or create the flow, we need to go up to the Action tab. Now, this was a little bit confusing the first time, because any reference to doing this talks about using the flows within the action. Now, you'll notice that there's no reference to flows here. So what we need to do is we need to, first of all, give this a name. So we'll call this the account form PowerApp. And now that we've given it a name, we'll save it. And save there. And that will go off and save the PowerApp as part of the solution. Now you might think, okay, having saved it, that might solve the problem. Well, yes and no, because you'll notice that flows is still not anywhere visible here. So you need to close the PowerApp. Now we've already saved it, so I can safely leave. Come back in from the Customize button. And after, as it says, getting things ready, we will hopefully see that having saved it, it will then, after we get rid of these annoying messages, under the action, now we have flows available. And that is where we have to create the flow from to get it to work. So a couple of slight little tricks to catch you out the first 1 or 2 times that you do this, but once you've got the hang of it, it's not so bad. All right, so that's the way you start off this process of creating these embedded Canvas app, connecting it to a flow to get the data that you want. So I'm going to close these down, go over to the contact entity, bring up the main form for the contact, and we'll scroll down to the SharePoint Docs tab. Now, as they say in the classics, here's one that I prepared earlier. So I've inserted the last name field into here. And if we go into the properties for the last name, swap over to controls, you can see that I've already got the Canvas app here. And we'll load it up. Now, one thing I should say is that you need to insert a field onto the form to attach your PowerApp to. So in this case, I've used the last name as the dummy field. Now, for all the fields in the audience, don't take offense. I'm just calling this one a dummy. I'm not referencing anybody else. So I've used the last name primarily because it's a required field. And if you use a required field to attach your Canvas app to, that means that your Canvas app is going to get refreshed whenever the source record gets refreshed. So it's just another little thing in there. All right, so here we go. We've got our Canvas app. Zoom it in a little just so we can see it. Now we've got here in this case the header. Now this was just a standard PowerApp. I've changed it over to a wider layout and increased the size that I've got available. So I've removed the standard, I just used the gallery Canvas app, removed the standard add controls, etc. Customize this to have let's just get rid of this, a couple of fields in here. So we've got a label for the file name, we've got a label for the file size, and we've got a button. So those are the three components within the repeatable section of our PowerApp. And you can see those under the browse gallery on the left side. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we need a flow to drive this. So let's have a look at that and then come back and see the rest of this being wired up. So having seen the tip from before, we now got access to the flows area. And this piece is where why you need to do it from within the PowerApp, because the flow needs to be listed here and available for whatever it is that you're using on the Canvas app. So let's go into edit the flow and wait for it to come up. Get rid of the messages. So in this case, we're starting off with a PowerApps trigger that just indicates that PowerApps is able to call this thing. Next, we want to list records from within CDS/CRM of the associated files that are stored in SharePoint. So we need to actually get the location from CRM/CDS that's associated with the record in question. So we select that we want which environment we want. And then for the entity name, we want the document location. So this is where we're getting the location out. And if we expand this out, we're getting the document location where the regarding object ID value is equal to a list records filter query. Okay, so we just keep that in mind. So that's basically just saying I'm going to expect something from the PowerApp to be able to filter this. Okay. And the thing that we're going to pass in is the reference to the contact primary key, or the GUID, or the ID, however you want to refer to it. So that's going to get us the particular record from the document locations, so we can find out where we should look in SharePoint. We'll collapse that down. The next step is to use a send HTTP request to SharePoint. And this is where we're going to ask SharePoint for the list of files. So first of all, we use the get the site address. So that's the address that's been linked to your CRM instance. And you need to have set up the SharePoint integration prior to get this to work. We need a get method, and then we're calling an API on SharePoint. And that API is the get folder by server relative URL, okay? Because the thing that's coming back from document locations is a relative place within SharePoint compared to the root folder. So we're saying go into the contact folder in SharePoint, and then let's just click on this expression. Then we're going to say from the list records. Now that's coming from this step in our flow. We want to get the value field. Which one do we want? We want the first one, which is 0 index. And from that, we want to get the relative URL. Okay, so although this is highlighted as a function, this is the function that's necessary. So if you're after it, I'll put it on the blog post with the video that I'll link in the video notes, so you can get access to these bits for copy and paste purposes. Then you need to tell it in the headers that what you're going to accept back is JSON data and you're expecting verbose data. So you want all of the details coming back. The last step in our flow is to return the relevant information back to our PowerApp. So we want to return a status code of 200 indicating we were successful. The body is going to be the body, as you can see from the little icon there, the SharePoint information. So that's the response or the results of it doing our SharePoint retrieve. Down here is where we need our JSON schema. Now, if you saw the virtual agent one, we can use the virtual agent video. We can use this use sample payload to generate schema to do that. And how do we do that? How do we get a sample to put in there? Well, that's a good question. We need to actually execute this flow once to actually get the results back, and then we can paste them into that. All right, so to do that, the first thing we need to do is to go back to our CRM instance, and from the URL up here, you'll see the @ID equals something, in this case a GUID. So we need to copy that GUID because that is what we're going to be passing from our PowerApp into our flow to ask it first to get the document locations, in this case for Alex Wu, and then get the SharePoint files. So let's go back to our flow. And what we can do is hit the test button. And in this case, we say, I'll perform the trigger action. So we save and test. And then, if you haven't run this before, it'll ask you just to approve the connection to the sources. In here, we need to provide the information that we're expecting, in this case, the parameter coming in. So what we can do is paste our GUID in there. Once we do that, we can run the flow. The flow will execute. And if we follow the done, that'll take us back here. And in the first case, it'll get down to here, but probably not get all the way out. So if we expand this, we can see here's our call. It's put in the relative URL that got back from the document locations. And down here under the outputs is the bit that we need. So if we do click in there and do a Control A, copy that, then we come back, edit our flow, come back into our advanced options, and then into our sample box, we can paste what we just got out. Now, one thing that causes a problem the first time that you do this, or that you need to clean up. So up here is all this, and we don't need to understand the full detail of this, but here we're saying the version events, we're passing back information. This information down here is not actually part of the structure of the data. So what you need to do is just delete these things that don't look like the rest, essentially. And if you leave them in there, it'll work fine. And you'll be able to run it and everything will look okay. However, when you go back to your PowerApp, the flow won't show up because PowerApps is verifying that it's going to get the correct output, and those extra tags in there at the bottom of it actually throw it out and the flow won't show up. So you do need to slightly modify what goes on in there, but it's not too bad. And it's much easier if you use Notepad++ or something. If you paste it into there, you'll see the section that needs to come out. All right. So we've done our flow. We've got our document location. We've retrieved the list of files and all of the metadata that goes with them. And now we've got our response going back to our PowerApp. All right. So let's leave that and let's get rid of our flow. We don't need the flow anymore. Oop. Let's stay on this. All right, so now we're back to our PowerApp. I think I clicked on something in the wrong order. All right, so let's have a look at what we've got. So for our browse gallery, for some reason it's not letting me select the bits that I want. Let's close our flow tab. Oh, we've hit a hitch. Let's leave our PowerApp and come back, I think. All right. So on our form, let's come back into our PowerApp. Hopefully it'll behave a little bit better this time. So we're going to go back into the same point and we're going to have a look at how it's going to actually get the data coming out. Let's get rid of the annoying messages, which keep coming up despite the fact that I've said I don't want them. All right, so in this case, we've got our flows. And you can see this is the flow we created. And when you click on it, in this case, it won't do it, but when you click on it, it adds it up to the flows that are associated with the form. So you need to get it up into that section so that the PowerApp knows that it can use that. All right, so once we've got that, need a little bit more room. All right, so once we've got that, then what we want is to come for our screen one, which is our gallery screen, come into our on visible. So as soon as the screen becomes visible, we're going to call this set function, which is going to set a collection within our PowerApp. So it's going to be called documents list. But what do we want to put into that? So here's the name of our flow. So that was the one that we did up in our flows here. We say .run because we want to run the flow. And we remember from when we looked at it, we need to pass the ID of the record that we want to search for. So we'll start from the inside and go out in the brackets. So we need to go to our model-driven form integration and get the data from that. So that's the data coming from our CRM form into our PowerApp. From that, we want to get the first record and we want the item ID. So that's the actual ID or the GUID for the contact in this case. And that's what's going to populate this documents list. So then we've got this documents list sitting there, having gone and retrieved our SharePoint files, or the metadata for our SharePoint files. So then it's just a case of saying, well, for our browse gallery, the actual items are coming from the documents list .d, that's fairly standard in JSON, and then the results within that. And that comes back to the structure of the data that we copied and pasted when we did the sample test just before. So you can take my word for this. So it just needs to be documents list, which is what got populated before, .d.results. All right, so that's saying the browse gallery is getting its data from there. Then it's just a matter of picking it, whichever fields of the metadata you want. So in this case, for our file name, for the text property, I'm using this item. So whichever record the browse gallery is pointing to, get the name for me. Likewise for the file size, I'm saying this item.length. I'm doing a little bit more here because it comes back in bytes, which not overly useful for a lot of people. So I'm converting that into a value, dividing it by 1,000, and then converting it back to text. And I'm specifying the format that I want. So with 1,000 separator and kilobytes. You could do it in megabytes if you wanted to, obviously. And then the last part of this is we need to give an action to the open button. So the action when we do the on select is to launch whatever application is going to handle this thing. So in this case, it's the SharePoint URL plus the server relative URL that's come back from SharePoint. So that whole thing together gives me a link to the actual file from SharePoint, and the launch function means that we're going to fire up on the local machine whatever application handles that type of file. And that is the main part of it. The only other part is that there's a refresh button up here if it's required, and that's got exactly the same thing as the on visible for the screen. So it just populates the documents list with the list of files that come back from SharePoint API. So again, if I just close out of this, we just go back and just see, so that this is the result. You can play around with font sizes and all those sort of wonderful things, but it's a fairly clean user experience for getting access to the SharePoint files that doesn't involve extra buttons or anything like that. Now, obviously in this case, the requirement wasn't to upload files. There's a PowerApps at the moment doesn't have the ability to select local files. So the typical way in CRM that we would do that is obviously an attachment to a note and then extract that, and we can extract it with a flow. We might do that in a different video, off the note and put it into the relevant SharePoint location. So that mechanism's the standard way we would do that. So there we go. That's what's involved in getting a cleaner interface. Probably implementing it is faster than the video, but that's the way that you can get that to work. So hopefully that's been of some use to you. If it has, please consider subscribing and liking the video, and we'll see you back in the next video soon. Thanks very much. Bye.